You ever heard of the Midnight Channel?
After more than 15 years since its original release, Persona 4 is finally getting the remake that it so well deserves. Persona 4 Revival is set to be released in February of next year, but Atlus has been hyping up the community with so many screenshots, video footage, just so much content, and I'm screeching, I'm clawing at my desk, I'm biting my monitor, I am dying of excitement for it. And of course, as an artist, I felt compelled into making an art piece for this to commemorate these awesome news that we just got. And so here is the process of me making that said illustration. My initial plan for it was to create a very simple dynamic composition featuring a store display with a few TV monitors, displaying the multiple midnight channels that we see throughout the game. And in the reflection of the store, we see the protagonist of the game, Yu Narukami, looking mesmerized at the TVs. My initial idea for this piece was to make sort of a GIF, something more dynamic. I wanted to add some movement, like the TVs turning on and off, something in the rhythm of the original trailer for the game, using the iconic soundtrack Pursuing Your True Self. But the more I started working on it, the idea started to evolve, and I decided, no, I'm gonna make a video instead of just a GIF. I'm gonna include the audio, and it's just gonna be sort of a cinematic hyping up for the release of the game. When I first started on this piece, I thought it wouldn't take so long to get it done, but clearly I was in over my head, because this illustration is essentially like 11 illustrations in one, because each image on each TV screen is its own character illustration, and then I have both the composition of the storefront as well as the composition of the reflection on the storefront. And everything had to be slightly modular, or in a way that I could take things away to edit the little video that I had planned out. So I had to have different states for this one illustration. One state where the TVs were turned off, another state where the TVs were turned on, and two states where you can see the reflection on the storefront, one without the protagonist and one with the protagonist. It was quite ambitious, and you're also gonna see towards the end that I had to do a lot of small tweaks to get things to look presentable, to look as polished as I wanted them to look. The total amount of hours that I spent just drawing this piece was around 32 hours, which, I mean, the total sounds like it's not that much. You can think like, oh, it's probably like a day or 3 days or something. But in the actual like time that it took me to draw this, it took me like 3 weeks, 2 weeks. I'm gonna put the dates on the screen here. But yeah, essentially it took me a long time, and it was really exhausting. It was really ambitious, and what kept me going was my hype for the game, my love for the game, as well as my love for the challenge. Because I always love pushing myself into creating new pieces that expand on my skills. This piece had so many different levels of rendering, so overall, even though this piece was very difficult and very ambitious, I was also very happy to work on it because it pushed my skills to the next level. It challenged me and kept me trying to figure out new ways to approach different aspects of the piece, and that's something I love. That I love learning more about art and, just like I said, improving on my skills. When it came time to start picking out the style that I wanted to approach this piece, I wasn't too sure if I would go with something that was very similar to the in-game style and try to mimic the style of the game, or if I would do something of my personal style. In the end, I sort of mixed both of them. I mean, my art style isn't so far different from the style of the game, or I mean, well, it is. I need to stay humble. It is very different from the style of the game. But I've been heavily influenced by the Persona art style, so it wasn't too alien for me, it wasn't too bizarre for me to go in a direction of more Persona style art. And overall, I'm very happy with how the characters turned out, the way that I stylized them and framed them in this composition. I felt very happy with how they turned out. And it was very important for me to nail this since they are the focal point of the composition. And paired alongside the characters, of course, is this environment that I built for this illustration. I studied a lot of different Japanese storefronts, took a lot of time researching Japanese streets to make sure I would build an environment that felt appropriate for the game, for the story, for the culture that the game takes place in. I wanted to create something that felt like it could exist within the universe of Persona, within the story of Persona 4. And so, of course, I took a lot of time researching the culture, researching several different pictures that I could find, and putting together this little street. Not only the storefront that you see with the TVs, as well as the street of stores that you see reflected on the glass. And a very important part of making this environment feel very lively and very accurate to real life was having these little pamphlets, these posters, all of these different images and things help really bring the composition to life and make it look like real life. And if you speak Japanese, you probably noticed that several of these signs and decals and all of these words sprinkled throughout the piece actually make absolutely no sense. And unfortunately, that is where my struggle came in. Unfortunately, I do not speak Japanese, and so since I don't know how to speak Japanese, what I ended up doing was just typing random nonsense on Google Translate, and I would take the kanji and I would slap on that drawing, and just, you know, the whole time I was just hoping and praying, like, please don't make something that sounds weird, you know? I'm always afraid of like somehow making a terrible sentence, and so I really hope if anybody watching speaks Japanese, please let me know if I wrote anything horrendous. I mean, some people on Twitter, once I posted this drawing, pointed out that like, there's a bunch of nonsense written around, and I was like, well, yes. Unfortunately, that is what happened, and I do think it adds a little bit of humor to the piece. But yeah, I just hope I didn't write anything too crazy on there. When rendering this piece, it became very overwhelming to approach it because it's such a large piece and it features so many different materials, it features so many different elements that when I finished flats and it finally came time to render it, I was frozen on the spot. I was very overwhelmed and scared. But of course, whenever that happens, I need to take a few steps back, and I have a post-it glued on my wall that says, go layer by layer. That is the most important thing to keep in mind, is that you're not doing the whole composition all at once. You need to do one thing after another. And so I took it very slowly. I went all the way to the bottom of my layer hierarchy and I started going layer by layer. First starting off with the textures, then I would do some basic shadows, and slowly that would build up the rendering process of this piece. But of course, that's not all. Like I said, there's so many different materials. These different materials all have different qualities to them. And as an artist, there's always going to be this moment where you need to analyze materials and break them down to help illustrate them in whatever composition you're making. For example, in this piece, it features a lot of different types of wood. It features a lot of glass, a lot of metals, plastic. All of these different materials need to be rendered accordingly to how these materials are in real life to help get across to the viewer, to the observer, that these materials are what they are. And so whenever I'm breaking down a material, I observe it and I start asking myself several questions to try to determine what aspects make this material look how it does. For example, is this material reflective or does it diffuse light? Is this material shiny? Is this material rough? Does it have a texture? Does it have color variation? What are aspects that make this material look like how it does? if you have a background in 3D modeling, you probably already know several of the qualities that go into making a material, and I have a little bit of experience with Blender, and so I know a few of aspects to look out for. And like I said, you pay attention to like how reflective, how much light it diffuses, how it reacts in the dark, things like that. Does this material have a sharpness in their shadow? Does this material have a softness in their shadow? These things are all aspects to look out for, and of course I look through a lot of different references, because of course whenever you're in doubt, you need to look into real life and look for references. Or even if you don't want to use a real life photo, you can also look for other artwork and see how other artists deal with representing these materials and these elements in their artwork. I think that is something that really helps a lot, especially if you're a beginner artist, because seeing a material already in its stylized form is much easier sometimes to some people. But of course, there is an argument there, like what is easier? Is it realism or is it stylized? It's a whole topic. I'm not gonna go into it today. Anyway, going back into what we were talking about, for these materials that I depicted here, for the wood, I made sure to add a lot of texture, like the grain, the color variation, add a little bit of shininess to it. For the plastic, depending on the plastic, there is very shiny plastic, there's plastic that diffuses a lot of light. Metals are usually very reflective. Glass is highly reflective and highly shiny. Shiny and reflective are two different qualities actually, but that's a whole nother point. And knowing all of these qualities, all of these details, helped me a lot into realizing what I had to do here. And so once again, from the beginning, I went layer by layer. Whenever I got stuck in a material, I would look up references for it. I would then go into the process of breaking the material down, analyzing what steps I would need to do to help represent this material in this art piece. And I would follow those steps and make the rendering for that particular element in that particular scenario. And of course, since we're talking about materials, let's talk about light dynamics. This particular piece features a very interesting light dynamic that happens with glass. What is that, you may ask? Well, there is this fascinating dynamic that happens with how glass can shift from being see-through to being reflective. Essentially, the concept behind this is that, like in this scenario, the glass will be see-through when there's light on either both sides of the glass or only on the inside of the glass. Meanwhile, it will become reflective if the inside is dark and the outside is light. So it's a very specific little dynamic. It was very interesting to portray this in a composition, and it's essentially the whole thing that this particular illustration hinges itself on, is on this light dynamic where the glass becomes reflective and see-through depending on if the inside of the store is lit up or not. For those who love physics, yay, you will probably be fascinated by my portrayal of this particular light dynamic. I feel like I did a good job portraying it. Of course, since it's an illustration, it's not exactly 100% accurate, but it worked. You know what? It worked. I did a decent enough job. I think you can get the idea across. And you know what? I count it as a win. The lighting in this piece was very specific because the buildings in the background are in shade, but there's a sun hitting the glass of the storefront where the camera is focused, and I wanted to get these elements across the best way that I could. I also had the protagonist in between both of these things, and he was lit up from the back, and because of his very light color scheme, it was very tricky and finicky to get the values to look right. I didn't want to wash out any of these elements. I tried various methods, various effect layers, tried a lot of different things. I think the final illustration did manage to get this idea across, but it definitely took me a while to get there, and making sure that the environment still looked visible and readable while also keeping it distinctly in shadow and in light was very tricky. Talking about rendering, the characters in this illustration have different art styles for rendering as the background. While the background and the environment, I try to go for a more realistic shading and overall like method. For the characters, I went with a more stylized cell shading to keep the characters not only in a more anime art style, just like you would see in the game, but also to maintain the readability that the characters have. When I was making the composition, I feared that the characters being in such a smaller portion of the overall frame would make them look very hard to read if I made them with any sort of like realistic shading, because the more values that are present, it can sometimes become very murky and blend the elements too much, and I didn't want that. I wanted to maintain the characters as readable as possible, and so I went with the cell shading. It worked greatly because it helped indeed maintain the values of the characters and their readability, and it also fit perfectly with the style of the game, you know? So, hey, it all goes well when it ends well. Honestly, this piece made me very anxious throughout the whole process of making it. There's a saying among artists that is, trust the process, and honestly, that is true. That always remains true. As an artist, you're gonna be looking at your work from beginning to end, and you're gonna be overthinking it, everything. You're gonna think, oh, this is not good enough, or you're gonna have so many different worries. When it reaches the end, you realize you were being silly. This was not as terrible as you were thinking. This is not the end of the world. Or you're gonna think, maybe I should have listened to myself. Sometimes that is the case. Well, for this particular piece, I felt very anxious when it came to the composition. When I started rendering out the flat colors, I realized like maybe this composition doesn't work too well on social media. The scale of the framing was weird. Like maybe I should have done something more dynamic that pushed more angles, made the image more exciting, because the way that this particular composition was framed had a very boxy perspective, and that made me very concerned that maybe wouldn't perform so well on social media. I also got, of course, overwhelmed throughout the entire piece. I already talked about this earlier, but when I was rendering all of these elements, it got really scary, like, oh my god, am I gonna be able to get this to look like I want it to look? Is this gonna look good? But thankfully, all of those anxieties and those terrible thoughts washed away as we finished the piece, because I could then see that I did a good job. You know, I'm happy with the job that I did. The final piece turned out really great, and so did the little animation that I made for it. I was very happy. Editing it made me very happy, even though I listened to the little riff, the piano notes for like way too long. I have it memorized in my head now. Dun, 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 dun. And and overall, it was great. One of the last things that I did for this piece at the very end was that indeed the framing of it was really weird. When I finished the piece and I started editing the video for it, I realized the negative space under it and on top of it looked really weird on the phone scale. And so I realized that maybe for the betterment of this piece, it would be in my best interest to spend another day working on this piece and paint the missing details on the top and bottom to increase the frame of the picture and make a more overall overall more harmonious composition with a full illustration rather than just this cut frame that I had worked on since the beginning. Honestly, I'm very excited for the game. I cannot wait until February. I've been just dying to play this game. Every new post from Atlas keeps making me more and more excited for it. I am really hyped for it. The Persona franchise is huge for me. It means so much. Especially Persona 4, since it was the first Persona game that I ever played. I fell in love with the characters, I fell in love with the story, And Persona just overall has influenced my life in so many ways. It changed my perspective on life. It changed how I go about my day, how I treat other people, how I engage with other people. Not only that, it has impacted my art so much. Like I mentioned briefly earlier, Persona influenced so much of my art style, but it also influenced so much of how I tell stories, how I make characters, how I design characters, and just overall, Persona means so much to me, and it makes me very happy to make this piece, that I was able to represent just another side of myself, that I was able to illustrate something for another interest of mine, and be able to show with you all my love for this franchise and this game. It means so much to me, and so yeah. I hope you guys loved to watch this little time-lapse video, hearing all my commentary. I know this video wasn't too educational. I didn't go into too much detail of how I go through about things. And if you guys are interested in hearing me talk more in detail how I go about rendering, how I go about just overall drawing, please let me know in the comments. And if you want to see more time lapses of my work with some voiceover, I have a lot more exclusively on my Patreon. Make sure to check it out if you can. If you want to support me, I am eternally grateful. Like, for example, I am eternally grateful to Deadeye, Starlight Showstar, Sans, Alan Omar, and all these other beautiful people that show up at the end of every single one of my videos. I'm really happy that you stayed this long, and kisses. I'll see you guys on the next one.